When the homeowners association in my neighborhood tried to take away my voting rights over a patch of brown grass, I figured I had two choices: either spend the rest of my summer arguing with people who loved clipboards more than common sense, or quietly learn their own rules better than they ever had. They never expected me to choose the second option, and they definitely never expected that one perfectly legal front yard would become the reason their favorite inspector couldn't even finish his weekly rounds. I live in a subdivision outside Columbus called Pine Hollow Crossing, one of those places where every mailbox matches, every porch light is the same style, and every neighbor waves at you while secretly wondering if your trash can stayed out 5 minutes too long after pickup. When my wife and I bought the house 6 years earlier, we actually liked that sense of order. We weren't looking for chaos. We just wanted a quiet place where our daughter could ride her bike without traffic flying past at 50 miles an hour. The HOA seemed harmless back then, mostly organizing block parties and reminding people to pressure wash their driveways every spring. Somewhere along the way, though, things changed. New board members came in, budgets got bigger, rules got longer, and suddenly everything became about appearances. The biggest obsession of all was grass. If your lawn wasn't exactly the right shade of green, exactly the right height, and perfectly uniform from curb to porch, someone would hear about it. The man responsible for making sure nobody escaped that standard was an inspector named Victor Harlan. He had retired from some middle management job years earlier, but retirement hadn't softened him. If anything, it gave him more time to patrol the neighborhood with a clipboard tucked under one arm like a sheriff carrying his badge. Every other Wednesday morning, right around 9 o'clock, you'd see him walking slowly down the sidewalks, stopping every few houses, scribbling notes without saying a word. Kids riding scooters would whisper, "There goes the grass cop," then laugh before their parents told them to keep their voices down. Victor never laughed. I honestly don't think I ever saw him smile unless someone was apologizing for a violation notice. My problem started after one of the wettest springs we'd had in years. There was a section along the front sidewalk where rainwater collected because the original grading on the property had never been done correctly. I tried everything. I reseeded twice, spread fresh topsoil, installed drainage channels, even paid a landscaping company to look at it. Every contractor told me the same thing: until the drainage issue underneath is fixed, that patch is always going to struggle. Unfortunately, fixing the drainage would have required digging into a utility easement, which meant permits, engineers, and a whole lot more money than replacing a few square feet of grass should ever cost. Then the first violation letter arrived. It wasn't even personal. It looked like it had been printed by a machine. Brown turf. Failure to maintain community aesthetic. Correct within 10 days or fines will begin. I called the HOA office because I honestly believed this was just a misunderstanding. The woman who answered introduced herself as Linda, the community manager, and before I even finished explaining the drainage problem, she interrupted me. "Every homeowner is expected to maintain the same standards," I said. "I'm not asking for lower standards. I'm telling you the ground itself has a drainage defect." She paused for maybe half a second before replying, "That's still your responsibility." I remember staring at the kitchen window after hanging up, looking at that tiny patch of brown grass and wondering how something so small could suddenly feel so personal. 10 days later, another letter showed up, then another. Each one came with a larger fine attached, like someone was feeding quarters into a parking meter that never stopped running. My neighbors started noticing. One afternoon, my next-door neighbor, Ben, walked over while I was watering the lawn. He nodded toward the mailbox and asked, "Another love letter?" I laughed because if I didn't laugh, I'd probably lose my temper. Ben shook his head and said, "They're making an example out of you." At first I thought he was exaggerating, but then I noticed something interesting. 2 streets over, another house had weeds growing almost knee-high along the fence, and nothing happened. Across the subdivision, someone had left a broken trailer parked in the driveway for weeks. No violation. Yet somehow my little patch of struggling grass had become a neighborhood emergency. That's when I started wondering if this wasn't really about landscaping anymore. Maybe somebody on the board simply didn't like hearing homeowners push back. 3 weeks later, Victor himself knocked on my front door. He stood there holding his clipboard like it was a courtroom file. "Mr. Carter," he said calmly, "I've documented violations during 3 consecutive inspection cycles. I'll be recommending to the board that your voting privileges be suspended until your property returns to compliance." He delivered every word with the confidence of someone who had already decided the outcome before knocking. I looked at him for a second, then asked, "You're telling me I could lose my vote over 12 square feet of grass?" He didn't blink. Community standards only work when they're consistently enforced. I almost laughed because it sounded rehearsed, like he'd practiced saying it in front of a bathroom mirror. Instead, I simply nodded and said, "Thank you for letting me know." His expression almost looked disappointed. I think he expected an argument, maybe even a shouting match he could write into another report. Instead, I closed the door, walked straight into my home office, pulled the community covenant binder off the shelf, and set it on my desk. If they wanted to play by the rules, I was about to learn every single one of them better than the people enforcing them. And before that next Wednesday inspection ever arrived, I already had a feeling the story was about to stop being about grass and start becoming something none of them saw coming. I spent that entire evening reading the governing documents one page at a time, not because I enjoyed legal language, but because I was tired of assuming the board actually knew what they were enforcing. Somewhere around 11 that night, my wife, Emily, walked into the office carrying 2 mugs of coffee, looked at the stack of papers spread across my desk, smiled, and asked, "Please tell me you're not planning to fight these people until 3 in the morning." I smiled back and said, "No, I'm planning to understand them." That turned out to be the difference. Most people stop reading after the first couple of pages because the language is dry enough to put you to sleep. But I kept going. Every definition, every amendment, every cross-reference. Around midnight, I found the section that changed everything. It required every front yard to maintain a neat, uniform appearance consistent with neighborhood standards. That sounded pretty strict until I noticed what wasn't there. There was no requirement that the lawn be natural grass, no sentence banning synthetic turf, no approved material list, nothing. They had spent pages describing appearance while completely forgetting to define how that appearance had to be achieved. I read it again just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. Then I printed the section, highlighted it, and laid it beside every landscaping rule the association had ever published. Same result every time. They had accidentally left a door wide open. I wasn't interested in exploiting a loophole just to be difficult, but if they were going to threaten my rights over a drainage problem they refused to acknowledge, I wasn't going to apologize for following their rules more carefully than they had. The next morning, I called 3 landscaping companies before work. The third one sent out the owner himself, a guy named Marcus, who had been installing premium synthetic lawns for sports facilities and luxury homes for years. After walking my yard for 10 minutes, he laughed and said, "You're not crazy. The drainage under this section is terrible. Whoever graded this subdivision cut corners." I asked him one question. "If I install synthetic turf here, will it violate any city ordinance?" He shook his head. "Not if we pull permits and follow code." That was exactly what I wanted to hear. We filed the permit application that afternoon, scheduled utility markings, confirmed setback requirements, and made sure every single document was signed before anyone touched my yard. I wasn't giving the HOA the smallest opportunity to claim I skipped a step. While we waited for the permit approval, the fines kept arriving. Each envelope almost felt theatrical by that point. $50 became $100, then $150. The amount wasn't what bothered me anymore. It was the attitude behind it. Every notice carried the same cold language about preserving community standards, yet not one person from the board had ever asked whether there might actually be a problem beneath the surface. Ben wandered over again one evening while I was checking the permit paperwork. "They're really doubling down." "Huh?" he asked. I handed him the newest violation letter. He read it, whistled, and shook his head. "You know what the funny part is?" he said. "My fence has been 2 inches taller than regulations allow for 4 years. Nobody's ever mentioned it." That comment stayed with me. The rules weren't really about consistency. They were about choosing when consistency was convenient. A week later, the permit came through, and Marcus's crew arrived just after sunrise. They removed every inch of natural grass from the front yard, corrected the base, improved the drainage underneath, compacted fresh stone, added the proper underlayment, then carefully rolled out the highest quality synthetic turf I'd ever seen. It wasn't the fake plastic-looking stuff people joked about 20 years ago. This looked almost too perfect. Every blade stood upright, every section matched exactly, and when the afternoon sun hit it, the entire lawn reflected light with this rich emerald color that looked almost unreal. Emily walked outside after the crew finished and laughed. "Our yard looks like it belongs in a golf commercial." I laughed too because she wasn't wrong. For the first time since we'd moved into Pine Hollow Crossing, I looked at the front yard without immediately noticing that ugly brown patch by the sidewalk. It was gone forever. More importantly, so was the drainage problem underneath it. The following Wednesday almost felt like waiting for opening day of baseball season. Around 9 o'clock, I heard the familiar rhythm of footsteps on the sidewalk. Victor was making his rounds exactly like always, clipboard tucked under his arm, expression completely unchanged. I watched through the front window without trying to hide. He reached my driveway, glanced toward the lawn, then slowed down. His head tilted slightly as if his brain needed another second to process what he was seeing. He stepped onto the walkway and took 3 careful steps forward. Then he stopped. The morning sunlight reflected across the perfectly uniform turf, bright enough that he actually narrowed his eyes. He raised the clipboard in front of his face to block the glare while studying the lawn from different angles. I couldn't help smiling. Technically speaking, my yard looked better than every natural lawn on the street. There wasn't a weed. There wasn't a brown spot. There wasn't a blade out of place. It was, by every written definition in the governing documents, completely compliant. Victor stood there for what felt like a full minute before pulling out a measuring tape. He measured the edge near the sidewalk. Then he measured another section closer to the porch. He crouched down, reached toward the grass, touched it with 2 fingers, and immediately realized what it was. His shoulders stiffened. He opened the covenant booklet he carried inside his clipboard, flicked through several pages, stopped, flipped backward again, then looked back at the lawn. Even from inside the house, I could tell he wasn't finding what he wanted. Finally, he walked back to the sidewalk without writing a single word. As he turned away, our eyes met through the front window. I gave him a small wave. He didn't wave back. He simply kept walking toward the next house, looking noticeably less confident than he had 30 minutes earlier. I thought maybe that would be the end of it. I underestimated how badly some people hate losing. 2 days later, I received an email announcing an emergency HOA board meeting to discuss amendments protecting neighborhood landscaping standards. That phrase alone told me everything. They weren't responding because my yard looked bad. They were responding because I had followed their rules and embarrassed them in the process. Ben called me before the meeting even started. "They're writing a rule just for you." I laughed quietly and said, "Maybe, but they're a little late." I already had an appointment scheduled with an attorney named Rachel Donovan, someone who specialized in property and association law. I laid every document across her conference table, including the permits, the inspection notices, photographs of the original drainage problem, copies of the governing documents, and the proposed amendment the board had circulated. She barely needed 15 minutes before looking up with a smile. "You did something most homeowners never do," she said. "You documented everything before acting." Then she pointed at the proposed amendment. "Even if they pass this, they can't retroactively punish an installation that was fully compliant and legally permitted before the rule existed." Hearing that from a lawyer felt like taking a deep breath after holding it underwater. Rachel agreed to attend the board meeting with me, and for the first time since this whole ridiculous battle over a patch of grass had started, I wasn't looking forward to defending myself anymore. I was looking forward to watching the board explain why they thought changing the rules after the fact somehow counted as fairness. The board meeting was held the following Tuesday evening inside the clubhouse, and by the time Emily and I walked in, every folding chair was already occupied. I'd expected maybe a dozen curious neighbors, but nearly 40 people showed up, and judging by the conversations happening around the room, word had spread that the grass issue had turned into something much bigger. Victor sat along one wall with his familiar clipboard resting on his lap, though for the first time since I'd met him, he avoided looking in my direction. The board president, Sharon Whitaker, called the meeting to order and immediately launched into a speech about protecting community values, preserving property prices, and maintaining neighborhood consistency. It all sounded polished until she introduced the proposed amendment banning synthetic turf in every front yard. Then she looked directly at me and said, "Certain recent installations have highlighted gaps in our governing documents that need immediate correction." She never mentioned my name, but she didn't have to. Everyone in that room knew exactly who she meant. Before the discussion could move any further, Rachel stood up beside me, introduced herself as my attorney, and politely asked whether the board had received the letter she had delivered that afternoon. Sharon's confident expression faded just enough for everyone to notice. She admitted they had. Rachel smiled and said, "Then you'll already know our position. My client's landscaping complies fully with every covenant that existed at the time of installation. Every required municipal permit was obtained. Every inspection was passed. And, under state law, any amendment adopted tonight cannot be applied retroactively to remove or penalize an existing lawful improvement. The room became noticeably quieter. Sharon shuffled through her papers while another board member whispered something in her ear. One of the older homeowners raised his hand and asked the question nobody on the board seemed prepared for. If the documents never prohibited artificial turf, why was he fined in the first place? Nobody answered immediately. Instead, Sharon circled back to talking about neighborhood image, but the conversation had already changed. Another neighbor stood up and mentioned the broken basketball hoop that had been leaning into the street for months without a violation notice. Someone else brought up abandoned boats sitting in driveways all winter. Then Ben stood, folded his arms, and said exactly what everyone had been thinking. So we're really here because one homeowner followed the rules better than the people writing them? A few people laughed. Others nodded. Victor shifted uncomfortably in his chair. It was the first time I had ever seen the balance of power in that room begin to tilt. The amendment was eventually put to a vote, but after nearly an hour of debate, the board's own attorney quietly advised delaying it for further legal review. Translation: they knew they were on shaky ground. The proposal died before it ever became an official rule. As people gathered their things and headed toward the parking lot, several neighbors walked over to shake my hand. Some admitted they had received questionable violation notices themselves but had simply paid the fines because fighting the HOA felt impossible. One elderly couple even thanked me for standing up when most people wouldn't. That surprised me more than anything else. I had never set out to become some neighborhood hero. I just wanted to stop being punished for a drainage problem I didn't create. Over the following months, something interesting happened. The board became noticeably more cautious. Violation letters became less frequent. Inspection reports included actual photographs instead of vague accusations. Homeowners started asking questions during meetings instead of quietly accepting whatever was placed in front of them. Even Victor changed. He still walked the neighborhood every other Wednesday morning with his clipboard. But whenever he reached my house, he crossed to the opposite sidewalk without slowing down. The first time I noticed it, I almost laughed out loud. The man who once threatened to take away my voting rights over 12 square feet of grass couldn't even bring himself to walk past the lawn anymore. Maybe the reflection still bothered his eyes. Or maybe it reminded him that rules work both ways. Looking back now, I realized the real lesson had nothing to do with synthetic turf. It wasn't about winning an argument or embarrassing the HOA. It was about understanding that authority should never replace accountability. Organizations, neighborhoods, even governments are built on written rules. And those rules are supposed to protect everyone equally, not become tools for whoever happens to be in charge that year. If I had simply paid the fines and stayed quiet, nothing would have changed. Instead, one careful decision forced an entire board to look at its own mistakes. Every time I mow the backyard now, I glance toward that perfectly green front lawn and smile. Not because it looks better than anyone else's, but because it reminds me that sometimes the smartest way to fight isn't by yelling louder. It's by reading one more page than the other side ever bothered to. Now I'm curious what you think. Was the HOA justified in trying to close what they saw as a loophole? Or were they abusing their authority because they couldn't admit they were wrong? If you had been in my position, would you have installed the artificial turf? Or would you have handled the situation differently? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because stories like this always spark strong opinions. And if you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who's ever had to deal with an HOA that thought it was above its own rules.